Let's get this out of the way. This episode's assume you've played Spec Ops and contains giant, catastrophic, potentially game-ruining spoilers. If you have any interest in playing Spec Ops, and I sincerely suggest you do play it, I'd avoid this video until you've completed the game. Oh, and this game also deals with some pretty heavy concepts, and as a result has some really twisted imagery, so if you're viewing at work, well, use your discretion. Okay, so now that you've been spoiler warned, is Spec Ops not the weirdest franchise to suddenly turn into this arty game that hates violent video games and the people who play them, or what? The series started as a tactical third-person shooter that rode in on the late 90s and early 2000s rush of strategic shooters like Rainbow Six and Counter-Strike. And like Rainbow Six, the games treated the concept of military service and armed combat with a lot of respect. Not the outright pornographic style of ludic fellatio that the military receives from Michael Bay-influenced modern titles, mind you, but they held servicemen in high regard and treated combat as dangerous and scary, but ultimately necessary. The series was started by Zombie Studios, who would later go on to make Blacklight Retribution, and was squeezed for 8 games in just 5 years, burning itself out in the process. Then for a whole decade, from 2002 until 2012, the series sat dormant as more arcadey titles like Halo and Gears of War rose to prominence. And now, 10 years later, it's back from out of nowhere and with a new developer, throwing Heart of Darkness references left and right and hating game violence, real warfare, and even the players themselves, all while attempting to throw everyone who plays the game into a quagmire of moral ambiguity and self-loathing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just start with brass tacks. Mechanically, the game is basically what would happen if you took Gears of War's cover system and Call of Duty's guns and damage model and pretty much stopped designing additional mechanics after that. The result is a game based around third-person cover mechanics with an emphasis on automatic hit-scan weapons and highly lethal gameplay. While the gameplay is perfectly functional, it's also perfectly safe and even boring. Up until about the hour-and-a-half to 2-hour mark, you'd be forgiven for thinking the game was just a rote, by-the-numbers third-person cover shooter, sort of a modernized, less tactical, and more action-oriented version of its ancestors. If you've played the first hour of the game, you've more or less played all 5 to 6 hours of it. And unfortunately, that's about as much as I can say about the mechanics by themselves. It does what it says on the tin. But if banal yet serviceable core mechanics were all the game had to offer, the game wouldn't really be worth discussing. What sets Spec Ops: The Line apart from other games, though, is the way it contextualizes these otherwise completely pedestrian mechanics. See, Spec Ops isn't really about what you do in the game space, it's about how it frames and reframes what those actions mean. Yeah, you're just shooting guys from behind cover. But who are you shooting? Why are you shooting them? Why are they shooting you? What is worth killing or even dying for? What does all of this violence even accomplish? The game assumes you're going to play it like it's just one of its shooter brethren and not ask these questions. It assumes the player has an itchy trigger finger and a disregard for narrative, and initially just steps back and lets the player go to town, mowing down quote-unquote bad guys. They don't even hide the fact that Walker and his squad are supposed to leave as soon as they find any survivors that necessitate picking up. Walker states it plainly in the game's opening cutscene.
We have our orders. Locate survivors, leave the city immediately. Radio command from outside the storm wall. They send in the cavalry, go home.
But then some shooting happens, and we forget all about the premise and the plot and start moving from action set piece to action set piece. Then, slowly at first, but more and more as the player makes progress, the developers not only ask those questions, but make a point of showing that the game itself has to be the ones to bring those questions up. And the answers generally paint our protagonist in increasingly negative light. On paper, at least, the game looks a lot like Max Payne 3. Both are third-person cover-based shooters that promote a narrative focus. Both feature unlikable American protagonists dealing with personal issues in a faraway land. Both heavily reference a film as their source of inspiration. The difference is that Max Payne's narrative was about a hopeless alcoholic's midlife crisis, while its gameplay was about shooting dudes in the face. In contrast, Spec Ops: The Line is a game about shooting dudes where the narrative contextualizes and comments on those acts. The gameplay doesn't really impact the story, at least not till the very end, but since the story and the gameplay are about the same thing, you don't suffer the crazy ludonarrative dissonance we saw in Max Payne. Instead, it forms a single cohesive package that lets you commit horrific acts based on little to no information, then pulls the curtain up and reveals just what those actions really meant. All of this is with the goal of criticizing modern game violence, primarily your dude bro action shooters like Call of Duty and Battlefield, but also games about shooting people in general.
Ah, geez. Where's all this violence coming from, man? Is it the video games? I bet it's the video games.
Just as BioShock can be seen as critical of the relationship between game narratives and player agency, and just as Portal can be seen as a dissection of traditional shooter mechanics from a feminist or at least feminine viewpoint, Spec Ops: The Line is another in a long line of video games that engages in a lot of navel-gazing about what makes video games work or not work. And while I agree with pretty much everyone that says this sort of insular dialogue by games about games is sort of masturbatory, Spec Ops is unique in that it isn't really a deconstruction so much as an outright evisceration and condemnation of its target. And the game seems to fixate on assaulting 3 thematic concepts it finds utterly troubling in its contemporaries. As formal systems, computer games often have problems with ambiguity. Most games, not all, but most, have win states. These can either be explicit win states, e.g. when the game reaches a particular state, you've won the game, or implicit win states, like once you've exhausted all the story missions in Grand Theft Auto, you've quote-unquote beaten the game, but you can still fool around in the open world. The problem with win states is that they contextualize play in such a way that anything that pushes you towards the win state is good, while anything that pushes you away from this win state is bad. For example, from a looting perspective, shooting the guys that are blocking your path forward in Call of Duty is an absolute good. It gets them out of the way so that you can safely traverse the map in order to reach the end, which is the level's win state, without any other mechanic suggesting something to the contrary, or a narrative recontextualization of those mechanics. The game's rhetorical position is that shooting these men is an unequivocally good thing. Consequently, the number of games where you're not ostensibly either playing the clear good guy or at least ironically playing a clear bad guy is alarmingly small. Games like Far Cry 2, Hitman, and maybe some Rockstar games like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption. But by and large, game stories reflect the black and white nature of the gameplay, and assure you that you're on one side or the other of a binary morality, usually the good side. This sort of reductionist moral philosophy is okay for family-oriented games like Mario. I don't think these games would be particularly improved if at the end Mario realizes that he himself has become a monster. But it's extremely dangerous in the context of modern military shooters because so much of the rest of the setting has a high level of fidelity to real life. Pairing these gameplay and narrative aesthetics that reinforce a binary morality with the visual and audio imagery of real-world military actions promotes the idea that these actions are either objectively good or evil. It propagandizes the glory of our own military actions while villainizing those of others. It argues against a more complete and complex understanding of events where both parties involved may be in some way at fault. It boils complex political situations and historical conflicts down to which one were the good guys again? Mario being an absolute good and Bowser being an absolute evil doesn't reduce human-turtle relations to a false dichotomy, but Western powers being shown as an absolute good crushing the evil Arab or Russian or Asian enemies boils complicated geopolitics down to an oversimplified fairy tale that's disingenuous rah-rah nationalism at best and destructive to meaningful discourse at worst. Spec Ops attacks this absolutist perspective by presenting soldiers who commit horrific acts ostensibly in the name of good. Walker's squad gets jumped in the beginning of the game, and so they fire back. They try to rescue a fellow American issuing a distress call, then get wrapped up in saving refugees from Conrad's army.
33rd's rounding up civilians. Why? Shit! You're gonna kill them all.
Can't let that happen, Walker.
We're not going to.
Then let's hurry up and get down there.
Until the halfway point of the game, Walker, Lugo, and Adams aren't motivated by anything other than their sense of justice and moral rectitude. Despite that, pain and death are all that seem to follow in their wake. When you're fired on at the beginning of the game, those guys thought you were the 33rd, come to take them back to their camp. They weren't terrorists waiting to jump you. When you assault the soldiers going after the CIA agents, the 33rd is genuinely trying to prevent a cover-up that ends in mass death. And charging forward in an assault on American troops in order to quote-unquote get to the bottom of things results in the deaths of countless civilians in what is undeniably the game's most gut-wrenching scene.
Are those civilians?
Where'd they come from? There's no camp here.
They took him from the nest.
That hotel back at the storm wall? No, those can't be the civvies that got kidnapped. It's not possible.
Spec Ops posits that good intentions don't necessarily result in moral action, and that taking human life because you believe it's justified due to the limited information you have might not be enough. It indicts other games like Call of Duty by suggesting that when you do stuff like this,
Affirmative. Crew, you are cleared to engage, but do not fire on the church. Whoa! Kaboom. Hot damn!
you're committing potentially terrible acts under the assumption that you're completely informed about your situation and your targets, or that you're fighting for an objective good, or that the sacrifices you're making, or forcing others to make, are justified when none of that may actually be the case.
Sweet dreams, bitch.
No one's moving. It's over.
He's right, Walker.
Okay. We're done.
The game then expands on this hatred of a black and white moral compass by presenting the nature of choice and its application as a motif. The games that Spec Ops is criticizing are about following orders, not about choice. Your only option is to go forward and kill people until the mission is accomplished. Several times throughout the game, Walker insists he didn't have a choice in his actions, and places the blame squarely on Conrad for forcing his hand.
You know we can't
Might not
use
have a
it.
choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice. No. There's really not.
This whole mission is fucked. We just took out a tower full of American troops.
They didn't leave us any choice.
You didn't leave us any choice.
Who's there?
One of your victims. One who was just following.
You gave us no choice.
But ludically speaking, Walker's right. As a player, you don't have a choice to call that mission off and go back. You don't have a choice to surrender yourself to the 33rd. You don't get to call in for backup like any sane person would do. You don't have an opportunity to solve problems diplomatically. And for a while there, you actually don't mind. I mean, that's what third-person shooters are, right? But the whole time the game was pushing you to want for an alternative. The game tricks you into dropping white phosphorus onto innocent refugees, then shows you the horrible outcome it blames you for. The game forces you to watch Lugo die for your sins as you continue on your futile revenge fantasy, then asks,
Do you feel like a hero yet?
This is not a game that revels in the chaos you're causing, it's a game that's disgusted with you. But it also made you that way. It's a game that, by highlighting a lack of choice as it turns you into a monster, begs you to consider what it means when a game presents shooting people and moving on as its only mechanic. Just as Walker blamed everything on Conrad, the player is intended to shift his or her culpability for these things onto the game mechanics, because, like Walker said, you had no choice. If Conrad is Walker's excuse for committing unspeakable violence, it's the game itself that serves that role for the player.
None of this would have happened if you just stopped. But on you marched. And for what? You're here because you wanted to feel like something you're not. A hero.
In light of that, when the game does give you a choice, it's quite deliberate. And unlike, say, the binary moral choices presented in BioShock or Infamous, the implications are usually really ambiguous. For example, after Riggs tricks you into helping him destroy the only water left in Dubai and condemning everyone in the city to death, he ends up trapped under a burning car. You have two options. You can ignore his begging and let him burn to death as you walk away, becoming responsible for that much more pain and death in Dubai. Or you can shoot him, performing a violent act of mercy on a man who had just condemned countless others to die a slow death from dehydration. At another point in the game, Conrad attempts to force you to shoot one of two men. You can kill a water thief who stole more than his allotted rations, or you can kill the soldier who apprehended him by killing 5 of that guy's family. Or you can refuse to kill either of them and end up killing several more people when Conrad sics the 33rd on you. And at the end of the game, when Walker's insanity is unveiled, they both turned out to have been dead anyways, rendering your entire choice moot. So what does your decision there say? It's difficult to place these sorts of decisions on a simple good-evil scale. Suffice it to say that Spec Ops: The Line takes issue with any game whose primary mechanic is shooting people, but takes time out of that particular activity to judge you by way of a series of moral quagmires. The game argues that framing moral choice as a separate and standalone construct implies everything outside of that construct is an amoral, ethically inert action, i.e. harvesting little sisters is evil, saving little sisters is good, and shooting up spliced up junkies or looting from the dead is neither good nor evil. In so doing, it indicts BioShock, Infamous, Fable, and others for ignoring the moral dilemmas core to their gameplay, and presenting a situation where a man killing dozens of other men can still be seen as a representative of unmolested virtue. Whether you're a good person doesn't boil down to a few set-piece moments, but a complex aggregation of all of your decisions, all of their outcomes, and how you reacted to each of them. And shooting people over and over again, despite the increasingly horrific output, says as much about Walker, the player, and the game both are playing as any scripted sequence. Spec Ops also attempts to portray pretty much all violence as a horrible act, which flies in the face of traditional shooter values. In the majority of other FPS games, the whole point is to mow down all your enemies and move on. And that fraction of a second between the bad guy getting hit and crumpling to the floor, that's the beginning and ending of his death having any meaning to you in those games. But Spec Ops wants you to realize that the people you're shooting down are people. Men with lives and family back home waiting to see them again. Some of them we get to know through collectible intel, like how we observe the radio man's fall from respectable journalist to insane entertainer.
Darden had obviously tuned out by the time we got here. But looking at his notes, it seems he'd been trying his hand at some honest-to-God journalism.
Several others are humanized with small talk before you swoop in to kill them.
Hard to believe there's any peace in a place like this, huh?
You gotta look for peace no matter where you are, man. Helps remind you what you're fighting for.
Yeah, true that. Anyway, thanks for the gum. I'm gonna go check upstairs.
And sometimes all it takes is a single image to show you the devastation and death that violence can cause. But more than that, Spec Ops wants to make it clear that violence scars not only the victim, but the predator as well. Over the course of the game, Walker and his team go from a standard, clean-cut, wisecracking video game trio to a squad that's broken morally, physically, and as a unit. Their grip on sanity collapses as Walker starts shooting mannequins he presumes to be enemies, and seeing friendly faces on those he kills.
God damn it, Walker! No! Jesus. What the fuck did you do, Walker?
Another one of the game's loading screens posits that Lugo may be a lucky one for dying because he would have returned home with PTSD and mountains of psychological damage. The point is that the idea of just going out and shooting some dudes who are bad guys and coming back home a champion and having a ticker tape parade about how great of a hero you are, it's a myth. It doesn't happen. Look at the number of soldiers in real life coming back from overseas with broken minds and broken bodies. Even of those who are ostensibly quote-unquote fine, how many are eager to talk about the things they saw and did as if they blew up the Death Star or threw the One Ring into Mount Doom? All of these things, the attacks on moral absolutism, the discussion about which choices are allotted to us and what that says about our actions in a game space, and the presentation of violence as a clean act that only harms those who are physically hurt, they all come together to form a cohesive denunciation of the modern shooter and the myth of the modern shooter hero. But another thing that separates this game from the likes of BioShock and Portal as a game about games is the secondary thematic thread that runs through the game. See, while the game's primary targets are AAA military shooters and other violent video games, there's no small amount of criticism of American military adventurism in here. I mean, the game's title screen opens with Jimi Hendrix playing a warped and distorted electric guitar version of the Star-Spangled Banner, while the American flag flutters upside down over an abandoned metropolis being swallowed by the desert. Every one of these things reflects American values, one being a national anthem, another being the Stars and Stripes, and the city itself a vibrant display of conspicuous consumerism and hardcore capitalism. But each one is twisted or off-kilter or decayed in some way. And Conrad's entire journey itself reflects a recent American military adventurism. He leads the 33rd into a Middle Eastern nation with noble intentions, but his actions result in death and loss on all sides. The primary objective turns out to have been a bust, and the whole operation ends with an American military occupation stuck with the responsibility for the lives of natives. Sound familiar? Then take all of that imagery and narrative content together with the themes of moral absolutism, the belief in righteous and clean violence, and having your hand quote-unquote forced to attack someone else. All things that have run strongly through contemporary American political rhetoric and media coverage. It quickly becomes apparent that Spec Ops isn't criticizing violent video games in a vacuum. It's making the implication that games which celebrate violence and moral absolutism, these games it so despises, are intrinsically linked to a culture that engages in destructive military adventurism. That's not to say that one causes the other, but that they're both symptoms of larger cultural issues, namely the belief in those three tenets.
You're either with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear. I will continue to make that clear.
America's Navy, a global force for good.
Spec Ops wants you to ask yourself why we play games like Call of Duty or Battlefield, and whether we're comfortable with sanitized violence that perversely is designed to make us feel good. But more than all of that, I think Spec Ops wants us to consider how games like Call of Duty and Battlefield fall into a larger culture. How these games reflect who we are, and also shape who we'll eventually become. It laments the violent recent past of games, but given how well these games continue to sell, it's also deeply worried about our future. Just know that when it comes to what games you buy and what games you play, you always have a choice.
There were over 5,000 people alive in Dubai the day before you arrived. How many are alive today, I wonder? How many will be alive tomorrow? I thought my duty was to protect this city from the storm. I was wrong.